يا رحمن يا الله يا رحمن يا رحيم يا كريم.
Did Imam Bukhari, this Sahih that we have, can we attribute this book back to Imam Bukhari? Because the level of knowledge about these foods is so low, a person can actually make a career out of just studying Madkhals. Is this the book that Imam Bukhari wrote that we have, or is it unreliable? Because to suggest that was nonsensical. Every student should, whenever you're going into any science, there has to be a balance between using an introductory book, but not to make those books as the goal itself.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are back with a new episode of the Islamic Book Review podcast with myself, Muhammad, and our esteemed Sheikh, Maulana Dr Zishan. And today is going to be a special episode. Today we're going to be discussing the famous book which many of you have most likely heard or have on your bookshelf or have seen in the masjid bookshelf. We are going to be discussing the famous book of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari, his famous Al-Sahih. And we will be discussing an introduction to this book, how to study this book, and many other things surrounding the Imam and his work, insha'Allah ta'ala. What we want to do is we're going to be focusing on a few books that introduce the work to students. And what I mean by this is that you have a genre of books called al-Madkhal. We're not talking about Madkhalis, that's different, that's a group. We're talking about Madkhal, it's a genre of book. Those books are designed to introduce to the student the subject matter or the book that it is discussing. So when we say al-Madkhal ila Sahih, it's an introduction to the Sahih of Imam Bukhari. And we have a number of them because it's a famous work, as is more logically, you can logically understand. The more famous a work, the more introductions or the more introductory works people will have for that particular work, and the less popular, then the less introductory works you will have for them. And we'll be discussing a number of them and we'll mention the names and the authors of those as we go along, insha'Allah ta'ala. And I want to just bring in Maulana Zishan at this point, and I want to ask him, it's been a long break. Before we begin, it's been a long break. How has your hiatus been? What's been happening in that time?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmadu salli wa nusallim ala rasulihil kareem. Amma ba'd. It's just been, I think, quite difficult to get together because I think everyone's been off doing stuff. But I went for Hajj, you went to Uzbekistan. Yeah. Kamera went for Umrah as well. So then I think everyone was a bit busy, so it's kind of difficult. And I had exam time madrasa as well, but this is like the third or fourth scheduling now. Yeah. So finally got together. Another point is that some of these books that I read them a while back. So we're going to be doing a bit more of a briefer podcast today, just to touch on some of these books rather than doing a much more of a deeper dive. Mm-hmm. For a couple of reasons, I'll explain as we go along. But yeah, just been busy. There's a few things we've been working on, inshallah, which we'll kind of talk more about in some coming episodes, inshallah. Inshallah.
As you heard, Maulana Zishan went Hajj. Had fun. He has some funny stories. If we have time, then you might mention one or two of them. I don't know. Not today. But just to start here, the Madkhal genre focuses on everything to do with the work. And the one that I read was by a contemporary scholar. His name is Muhammadi ibn Muhammad al-Nurastani. And he wrote a book called Al-Madkhal ila Sahih al-Imam Al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, and he published it very, very recently. It's 2023, the latest publication of it. This author, and this scholar, he's got multiple introductory works to multiple hadith works. He's got books dealing with introductions to the Sittah, and then he's also got other hadith works which are not commonly known to the laity, like the Sahih of Ibn Hibban, Musnad Ahmad, and Sahih ibn Khuzaymah, and all of these other works that come and students find out about later on once they study in the hadith studies. Now, in this book, and I think this will be generally the theme across all of them, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
If you can just kind of twist it around a bit for a second. So we kind of distribute the book. So this is your book that you've read. I've not read Nurastani's book. So this is your book that you've read.
Yeah.
So what level of student would you expect to pick up this book?
So if we're talking about the Dars Nizami kind of student, or you're looking at someone who's finishing his 5th year, going into his 6th year would be able to pick up this book, if not in his 6th year, preparing for his final year of hadith. It's fairly simple in terms of the Arabic. There's not many difficult words in there, apart from the quotations he provides from classical scholarship about Imam Bukhari, about the book, and from the book itself. The book is very nicely laid out. It's got abwab and fusul. It's got chapters and subheadings that really separate that book out. Makes it easy to navigate, as opposed to just referencing things. He quotes them and he puts the reference in the footnote, but he quotes them in full for you. So you don't have to keep looking back at the actual book, Sahih Bukhari, and having to flip back and forth. So in that way, it's a very easy book for the average student, in the sense that it's not too difficult.
And this is not, he's not providing any like personal analysis of the book. It's more of just, this is what we know, the standard, what we know about Bukhari, what we know about his recensions, whatever it is. The commentaries, I assume, he looks at. Is that rather than him giving his any personal insights of saying, here's some of the examples what I found, or engaging with some of the quotations? Is it just a simplified introduction for students?
It seems so. It's not much of his own analysis. He doesn't really engage with tertiary discussions with regards to the Sahih. Rather, he focuses on breaking down the factual information that you know about Imam Bukhari, his Sahih, and about the wider reading and the wider things, like you mentioned, the shuruhat, the commentaries, the editions of the book, and everything like that. That's what he focuses on. His kind of you can say contents page is laid out like this, and I think most of them would be laid out like this. He starts off with a biography of Imam Bukhari, like his general life and times. Then he mentions his academic life. What did he achieve in terms of academia? He then talks about Sahih Al Bukhari itself, the specific book. What is it? What is included in it? The editions of the book. All of these different things. Then he goes on to mentioning the methodology of Imam Bukhari. And again, this is very much a factual analysis. He looks at other authors, what they've mentioned, especially classical authors, Ibn Hajar, etc. And he's put that all in the book, saying that this is what Imam Bukhari does this, Imam Bukhari does this, with examples. And that's the key part. I think that's the main benefit of this, is that it gives examples. It's not too short. And this is kind of his book. It's a very short book. It's about 227 pages in that sense, but then a lot of it is, like you have the pages at the beginning and your pages at the end, that contents. So it kind of decreases around 200 pages. 200 pages. So it's not too in depth. And I would say one big benefit that I did gain from this was that he has, when it talks about the nusakh, when he talks about the different manuscripts to do with the book, he breaks it down as to which manuscripts we have, which manuscripts are relied upon in the editions that are published, and he gives you a nice easy way of understanding what's going on in that kind of sphere. Because that and you may be able to tell me different, but that kind of part of scholarship is quite niche. It's very specific, very closed off from the average student. That manuscripts and editions and people, scribes of manuscripts, those kind of things don't really get looked at by the average student. So for that to be simplified and made easy is very important, I think.
Okay, that's very good. But it's good that we make a distinction here, because the books that I'll be looking at, we're going to kind of take a bit of a sidetrack away from Madkhal and come back to it. But because the books I've looked at are much more, I'll say more, they focus more on niche topics. So they're not your... what the role of actual madkhal is, because in madkhal it means introduction. So, but the author, when doing a madkhal, has different purposes in mind. So, from what I'm aware of from Nuristani's book, because as you mentioned, he's done for Kutub al-Sitta and other books, is that a person not aware so much about Sahih Bukhari, and let me introduce you to Imam Bukhari in Sahih. And so, therefore, the 4th year student in Mishkat, whoever can go and read it, or anyone else for that matter who's a student of Islamic sciences, they can read those works. But the books that I've got here, what I found is quite different, even though some of them are called, they're all called Madkhal, or 2 of them are called Madkhals, right? And one is actually not a Madkhal at all. There's one point I want to mention about Madkhal, and I'll come on to this as well, inshallah, is that the introduction, the idea of writing introductions to books, etc., is not completely a new phenomena, but it's relatively a new phenomena, where you kind of write an introduction to those. So you have this genre of Khatm al-Bukhari, Khatm Abu Dawud, Imam Sakhawi have these books which are these kind of madkhal type of books that we kind of think about now, even though it's written hundreds of years ago. But now a lot of scholars, when they are teaching books or teaching subjects, they feel like for their students, I think it's important that we write like an introductory book. In the past, there's quite an interesting phenomena that a lot of students of fiqh will know about is the way kind of fiqh operates is you have one person writes a book and it's quite an amazing long book. And so if I'm teaching the book or I'm going through it, I think I require to write to do an ikhtisar of it, an abridgment for my students. So a student may look at the ikhtisar and say, this is a great ikhtisar. I think I need to make it into a poem. So they make it into a manzuma. So then they're teaching and the student comes along and says, this is very good. I think it requires commentary. And then you have this kind of, this phenomenon that takes place in fiqh where books come back and forth like that.
To make it easier for the student. It's all with the student in mind to make it easier for him according to the ability of the students themselves.
Yeah, and it also it's like their contribution they make as well to the thing. So you like a good example is like the book Al-Manar. If you go look at the idea of the Usul al-Fiqh book Al-Manar by Nasafi, you look at commentary, super commentary, mukhtasar, manzuma, commentary, super commentary, you see like a whole range and a commentary of a commentary and so on and so forth. Now, why is that relevant here is because nowadays that is not done as much. For example, if I'm teaching Hidayah, it's more common, I'm not too sure exactly why, but it's more common rather than me publishing my hashia or notes on Hidayah, it's more likely for a person to write a introduction to Hidayah. Because I've been engaging with this book for so long, I think I'm to some level ready now to tell you this is what I've learned from the book, and so you can actually use as an introduction to come into the book. And it's become far more of a phenomenon. So now every year it's so hard to keep up to date with them because of the amount of madkhals that come into it. So how should a student, like the question I was asking, how does a student navigate through this? Well, what I would say is there's two types of madkhals. One is the madkhal that you've gone through. And I think it's important for every student that begins any ulum is to try to find those madkhals. So for Bukhari, that makes a lot of sense, even though the books that I'm looking at here are far more advanced and are far more, you can say, well-researched. But they're not going to be accessible to the person because what some of these books are like the product of a person's years of studying and engagement with the book. So it's their introduction, but they have discussions which are way above the pay grade of a fifth-year Mishkat student or someone who's coming new to the field. So that's one thing. Number two is that because a sheer number of madkhals, introductory books where you can learn about science rather than doing the science, what this does is it gives a lot of people a superficial understanding of a science. So I can do not just Islamic ulum, it works in all ulum. What do I mean by this is, if let's say there's a book about the history or the introduction to Lugha. So what I can do is I can open up that book, I can read through it, and then they'll tell me, well, the Basri school does this. These are the famous imams. The Basri school is the famous imams of the Kufan school. This is their name. This is their book. So what I can do is I can go and teach a lesson. I can come here and say, Imam such and such, he wrote this book. This was his manhaj. This is such and such book. He wrote this. He died this year. So you can give the perception to a person that I am very well read, but I've never actually engaged with the actual science itself. But what you realize is that because the level of knowledge about these fields is so low, a person can actually make a career out of just studying madkhals. So what that does is, and one of the downsides of madkhals is that if the madkhal, the introductory book, becomes the goal, no longer as the means, then you can dupe people into thinking that you know, or you can dupe yourself into thinking you know about the science. But any expert of the field will look straight through and say, look, I know what you've done. Right, so that's one of the phenomena that I see a lot of students, and it's not just because of deception. Number two is that it's an easier way because a madkhal, introductory book, is like someone holding your hand through that book. So rather than having to go through the difficult of going through yourself, so I would say every student should, whenever you're going into any science, there has to be a balance between using an introductory book, but not to make those books as the goal itself. So you spend all your time reading about introduction to Hanafi madhab, for example, right? Who were the chronology of the imams? Who memorized, who wrote which book, what century did they die in, the terms are used, the manhaj, and when muhit is mentioned, what does it refer to? That's all important, but you're going to pick that up naturally because the scholar who's telling you that, the list, how do they know? It's because they engaged with the books for so many years and they picked up on these nuggets of information they present in a book. But you need to also engage with the books because then you'll find out other nuances that does missed on them. So you can't, these introductory books are not going to be able to take the role of, or they take the place of actually going and doing the science. And this applies to actually all ulum, even even secular sciences as well.
I guess the point here is that if you do read whichever madkhal you do engage in this one or the ones that you've read or any other ones, because there's many on Sahih Bukhari, it won't leave you free of need from actually engaging with the Sahih.
No.
It won't leave you free of need of actually reading what Imam Bukhari did in his book,
Mm.
the different gems that you find in there. It won't be given to you on a plate.
And all of these, especially the examples they give of the conditions of Bukhari, all of these stuff are contentious themselves. So you're never going to be able to learn about that if you're just relying upon an introduction, just someone else's lens through it. So I'm just saying is that introductions are important, but don't make that the goal itself. Try to have time with the book, the science itself. And that applies to all science. And I'll go on about this in other podcasts as well, because I think it's a fundamental issue. Now, before we move on to Madkhal, there's this book that I want to kind of speak about. Because the Sahih of Imam Bukhari has so many facets to it, and you can literally just do podcast after podcast on Bukhari, and it's not an understatement. Literally, we can go on because the amount of books written on Bukhari, it will take a lifetime just to read the amount of books. Every month there's a new book that's come out, and articles come out, and historically classical books that have been written on Bukhari is immense. So we're talking about Imam Bukhari, referring to his life and times. Then, of course, his Sahih. Let's look beyond the other books Imam Bukhari wrote. So his Sahih itself. So you have the chapter headings of Bukhari. You have the narrators of Bukhari, the Shurut of Bukhari, the Shuyukh of Bukhari. And types of narration of Bukhari. Then you have, of course, the text itself of the hadith. Right? The fiqh, that's saying what is Imam Bukhari alluding to. The mu'allaqat of Bukhari. Each one of these things, you have separate books written just dedicated to those separate, those very specific topics. And then you have these super commentaries like the Fathul Bari, the Umdatul Qari, which are, these massive works that have all of this going on. So it's so much, right? So how does a person, so we're just going to touch on a few little issues here and there. And in the future, as we see books that I think are useful to kind of introduce. But this book over here that I have is called The Textual Integrity of Sahih Bukhari, a study of the primary recensions, textual variation, transmission of the Sahih. So we're going to go in a bit of a tangent, all right?
Just before this as well, obviously many people might be aware, many people might not be aware. What's a recension?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, because I think that is a good place to start. That's
right. Yeah. So what we're looking at, let's go into that because this is written by Mufti Muntasir Zaman. Right, we'll come to this second. Right, why is this such the recension of Bukhari or the recensions of Bukhari, the textual integrity that he's writing about? What happened was, throughout the centuries, there hasn't been any real questioning of the text of Sahih Bukhari. Any text, by the way, right? That's historical text. It comes through the hands of scribes. So then there are mechanisms put into place to try to preserve the text as much as possible. But there's always going to be, because it's going through, like even books that are published, they go through typos and also that happens, right? So any large text especially, right? So if you talk about small articles, it's different. But if you talk about any large text, even with the modern publications, there tends to be certain errors that will come into play, or there'll be a debate if the author's dead, what exactly is that text must look like? So with handwritten scripts, you expect that much more. So great effort was made to kind of be very meticulous in going through the exact letters, what exactly it was part of the Sahih, where there may have been a mistake, where there's been a debate, errors, and so on and so forth.
Not part of the original.
So there's been great, amount of effort done on that. So historically, there's not been a question mark or this bizarre question of, did Imam Bukhari, this Sahih that we have, can we attribute this book back to Imam Bukhari?
Is that what he wrote?
Is this the book that Imam Bukhari wrote that we have, or is it unreliable? Because to suggest that was nonsensical. Like, it wasn't an idea that you would kind of, it's like if I came, now it's difficult, everyone believes in everything nowadays, right? But if I was trying to give an example that, is the moon made from cheese or something like that, right? I assume no one believes in that, right? But so now, if I say, well, show me the journal articles of scientists that have debunked the moon being made from cheese, you'd be like, well, no. So, well, there's my point, right? You can't prove anything to the contrary. But you say, but it's such a stupid question that you're not going to have people engaging with it. And so, even though there are odd references to this, but the text of Bukhari was very well preserved and, popularly accepted across the board. And even opponents, if they attacked Bukhari, it wasn't because of saying that this is not from Imam Bukhari. The text was attacked because of groups saying this is not from the Prophet ﷺ. So it wasn't actually challenging the integrity of Sahih Bukhari. But in recent years, there's been a book written by a guy called Rashid Ayal, which is called Sahih Bukhari Nihayat Astura. All right, so this is like it's like a tale of Sahih Bukhari. It's like a folk tale. And in this book, he kind of puts this thing forward that, well, where's the original text of Sahih Bukhari? Where's the handwritten copy of Imam Bukhari? Do we have that? And so for the non-learned reader, they may think that's a good question. Where's Imam Bukhari's manuscript copy? Where's his signed copy? Do we have it or not? And when someone says, no, we don't, doesn't that start to put questions into it? So he kind of suggests this. And I think a few years ago in the UK, there was a guy in Birmingham who really tried to push this idea as well. And the reason why they tried to push this idea on Sahih Bukhari was the fact that there are hadith in Bukhari that challenge certain views that people hold. So, for example, a person finds it unethical that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ married Aisha anha at that age. But then you've got this problem to deal with the fact that that's mentioned in Sahih Bukhari. Right? You have an issue that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ was affected by magic. But then it's in Sahih Bukhari. Right? You have an issue that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ mentions the hadith of Musa alayhi salam, that when he was having a bath and the rock ran away with his clothes, how can that be? But it's in Sahih Bukhari. And so there's only, when it's outside of Bukhari, you can try to wriggle around saying maybe it's authentic and stuff, but it's in Sahih, and we call it the authentic collection of Imam Bukhari. So then we have to look for ways of trying to discredit the Sahih. So this individual and few individuals were looking for ways, but after a while it gets a bit desperate. I mean, how much ta'weel or interpretation can you do, or how many times can you keep on saying that, or in the Sanad does this person try to play acrobatics, try to weaken a hadith? So an easier way is to say, well, how do we even know that this text that we have is from Imam Bukhari? So a lot of recent madkhals now, because of these objections, they also deal with this question. So they talk about the transmission of Bukhari. I mean, how did Imam Bukhari's book come down to us? The different recensions of it, so people who transmitted it, their copies of the book, right?
You have the students of Imam Bukhari each having their own copy that would become one recension each.
Yeah, and then from there, you will have people that transmit it down, and then there'll be various recensions, and these will have minor differences because of whatever, there could be various factors involved in them. So the Sahih of Imam Bukhari, it comes down through his student Al-Farabri. Muhammad Yusuf Farabri is his student of Bukhari, and there's many other recensions, but this was the one that we have preserved now because of various reasons. And so the objection was, well, how do we explain that phenomena that Farabri is the only one that we have? How can we trust this Farabri guy? Right? That's the question. So articles were written about some of the recensions of Bukhari that have came out, how they went through it, preserved it. So Mufti Muntasir is literally dealing with that question in this book. So it's quite, the actual book itself is not that large. It's about 100 pages, right? It's the first 100 pages. And what he does in this book is, it's a very dense book. So this is small, but there's a lot of footnotes, a lot of further readings that you can do, and it's very carefully analyzed. So what he does is, he finds that Farabri's recension of Sahih Bukhari that we have, the non-Farabri recension of Sahih Bukhari, we don't have any full copies of them, right? You have Khattabi using Hamad al-Shakir's one, you've got other people quoting them. So what he tries to do is he goes through these commentaries of people that had access to these other recensions. And the question, the conspiracy people try to suggest is saying, what did the other recensions look like? If there are differences, what do they look like? But alhamdulillah, we actually have a lot of the commentators noting down these differences from the other recensions of Sahih Bukhari. And when you do a comparison, you start to notice that the nature of the variants that are cited are those same variants that you expect in terms of like being a dhamir hu or hum, right? It could be a hamza missing, or could be something like just this standard variants that you expect in Arabic. Nothing, hardly anything is of meaning, right? So what?
Full sentences missing or full, paragraphs.
You have differences in terms of so there wouldn't be any significant meaningful differences that you have, but then there will be some, right? And that's why we accept that the text of Bukhari, the reason why it gets the Sahih stamp of approval is because of the amount of critical rigor he had to go through. So therefore, there are a hadith. So when we say Sahih Bukhari, for example, is Sahih, it's not because Imam Bukhari was just an imam and everyone said, great. No, one of the points that I will mention after is that we know that Imam Bukhari in his lifetime went through trials. So scholars were not averse to criticizing Imam Bukhari. So there was nothing in his character that people said, no, we can't say anything about Imam Bukhari. They were open to it. But that's the point, yes. So the reason why the Sahih is given Sahih is not because of Imam Bukhari is given exceptions. It's because of the critical reception that it received and it passed through. And that's why there are sections in Sahih Bukhari that are debated, right? Out of a hadith collection which is so large, to have sections which are disputed is not something that was discovered by some critical scholar today. These are something mentioned by our ulama centuries ago. It's the same thing when people talk about the ahruf of the Quran, the variants in the Quran. And so we look, well, who told you that difference? Who preserved that variant, right? We have the different mushafs that were sent about Uthman ibn Affan. And people said, look, we found a variant. Well, who were the scholars that mentioned that there were variants in the masahif?
The same masters
of the Qur'an. They preserved it for us. It wasn't that, some Orientalists came in the 21st century and said, oh, look what I've discovered in the manuscript. It was, these are the books of Abu Amr al-Dani and the Qurra, and they're telling us it. So similarly, when it comes to Bukhari, is our scholars telling us that, look, there's a difference here. This wording, is it from Imam Bukhari or someone added? Yes, they are, but that's part of the preservation of the text, that these debates are there because of how meticulous you're being. The text that no one cares about, it gets left unchecked. So therefore, there's much more a greater chance of errors in that text because not many people are focusing and honing in on the text. And the larger text, the more you have that. So anyway, so what he demonstrates in this book, because you can show Farabri being great by looking at all the scholars that accepted him. All the scholars, all the Recensions of Bukhari that we have goes back to Farabri, right? All the commentaries, you look at the Fathul Baris, Umdul Qaris, Qastallanis, Irshad Sari, all the commentaries that you have, all the published editions that we have, all go back to Farabri. All your Asani that you have go back to Farabri. Go check it out, right? So we can look at that as an evidence-based argument from authority. So someone can turn around and say, well, why? How can we just trust Farabri? So what Mufti Muntasir is doing in this book, he's saying, well, let me tell you why you can trust Farabri. Because you can go and compare his books to where the variants are noted, and you see that he's very accurate, very meticulous. And these are the only type of variants that you can find. And he also in this book goes in the beginning of talking about why Farabri became popularized and all of that. He goes into quite a lot of detail into that. So it's a very useful book, but it's quite of a niche topic. So I would advise the two things I would say. Number one, I've said to Mufti Muntasir myself, is that he should work on this translating this in Arabic, because there'll be a wider audience that will be appreciative of the study. In English, so if you're like a beginning student, it still helps you a lot to go through, by the way. So if you don't, because English and it's readable. So if you're a Mishkat year student, you can still read through and understand the notion of how Bukhari was transmitted in English. It does help. And he's also got another book before this, but on Ahmed Sahanpuri's recension, where he discusses a lot of these topics as well. But then he moves into a very niche topic. So if you're not interested in that very specific niche discussion, then some of the book may not be so relevant to you. And so just the first, 40, 50 pages would be very useful. But this is something I wanted to mention because there's very few books like this in English that are doing the rounds. And this is something that I think should be put to one's reading list. And if you're someone that's interested in the notion of Bukhari's transmission, then most definitely. Mufti Muntasir Zaman is also working on a website. He sent me a link, so working on it, but it's a link on Bukhari itself. So basically we have his articles, and it's got very cool type of like a biography of Imam Bukhari, where you can kind of follow each phase of his life, and it kind of zooms into the location, the geographical location where he's in. So if he's in Bukhara, the screen is focusing Bukhara. As you come down, because then he traveled to Baghdad, and the camera, or whatever it is, the screen will go all the way to map in Baghdad. It's very cool things he's got. So that will be a resource which I'll share once it's done on the Telegram channel. That would be something that I think will be very useful in English for students of the Sahih.
The next work, because we're a bit short on time as well, I want to keep it brief. We're going to ask questions later. The next work that you looked at, what was that?
Okay, so let's move on to, there's 3 books I want to quickly talk about, right? So because we spoke about the recensions of Bukhari, this is not a book that I'm going to review right now, but if someone is interested, And there's 2 books that I would advise you to read. One of them is this book, which is called روايات الجامع الصحيح للإمام البخاري رواية أبي ذر الحروي نموذجا دراسة تحليلية مقارنة by دكتورة الشفاء علي حسن الفقي, which goes into the transmission of Sahih Bukhari in quite some detail and looks at the Riwayat Abu Dharr al-Harawi as a case study, because that's one of the transmitters that comes 2-3 centuries after, 2-3 tabaqas later. It goes into his recensions. So it's more of a advanced read, but it's very useful for those. And one I would also advise, it's a bit more easier to navigate. It's a larger book, but easier to navigate through. It's available online. It's called روايات الجامع الصحيح ونسخه, right, by Dr Jumaa Fahmi. All right, I'll put these names up. This is a very useful book. It's available online. Mufti Muntasir's got articles. I wrote one article some years back on this, which is called Al-Yunini and the Transmission of Sahih Bukhari, which we'll come to Yunini, who he is in a second, which you can see online as well. These will be some of the works that discuss the idea of transmission. One of the books that we looked at, which also touches a lot on transmission as well, is this introduction, right, which is called المدخل إلى الجامع المسند الصحيح والنسخة اليونانية, which is known as the Bayt Sunnah edition of Sahih Bukhari. It's a recent edition of Sahih Bukhari. And alongside the recent edition of Sahih Bukhari, they wrote an introduction. And that's common. Most books that get published now, if you're going to publish Sahih Muslim, Bukhari, what book you're going to publish, you expect to write some sort of introduction in the beginning. And some authors, what they would do is, what every critical edition of a book will mention is methodology. So that's a must. But then beyond that, how much detail they want to go into introducing the book, that's kind of up to them. We're not going to discuss how good the edition is, what's the best edition of Sahih Bukhari. The reason being is because it's a whole different topic itself, and it's not an easy topic. What I mean by this is, a lot of students, they will come and they'll say, what's the best edition of this book, right? Or let's say this book has come out, Bayt Sunnah. Is this the best edition of Sahih Bukhari?
The question comes in terms of what?
Not just that. So, okay, yeah, that's first question. That's a good point, right? So first is in terms of what you're looking for. So sometimes a lot of students, when they're looking for best editions, their idea of a best edition is, does it have tashkil, right? Is the text clear? What commentaries does it have? It does make a difference, right? So there's good quality, and you know, how does it feel, and all that kind of stuff, right? Can I write notes on the side? That's what a lot of the students, which I will be looking for. But when you're asking someone, is this a good edition? What in scholarship that means is that, how accurate is this as a presentation of the actual text?
How close is it to what Imam Bukhari wrote? Is this the most accurate thing?
Yeah. So this is what you're trying to look for when you're looking at a good edition. But that's a very difficult question to answer. Why? Because if a new book has come out, so how would I know how accurate this is? So you look at its introduction, and they'll explain their manhaj, but I can say I've done everything. Like I can say, well, I looked at 40 manuscripts and I spent 10 years. That's great, but the only time we're going to know how good it is someone has to sit there, go through this, right? Compare it with other critical editions, see where they differ, why they differ, who's making a mistake, right? See if there's typos. Every book tends to have typos. How common are the typos? How bad are the typos? Are there examples of text out the text being read wrong? So that requires a lot of time, and no one just, regardless of how great a scholar someone is, to sit there and just go for Bukhari again, it takes a year to go through Bukhari in Dawrah, right? So just to go through one edition, so what normally people do is they go through sections and they kind of then praise the text, or they would dispraise the text. In some cases, it can be very clear. So there are times where you may open a book and you say, within a couple of hours of reading, you think, okay, this is quite bad, right? They make a lot of mistakes, they're doing whatever they're doing, right? But with this Bayt Sunnah edition, like Darul Ta'sil, the edition as well, a lot of effort seems to be made in going through to produce a meticulous edition. So if you do, what I would advise students is to kind of, when people ask this question and saying that when you're doing Dawrah, especially those in Dawrah Hadith, so as a rule of thumb, I normally say Darul Ta'sil edition is a safe option. They tend to be very meticulous and good, but there's always going to be people that make, as you say, there's mistakes and stuff, right?
Accuracy of the text.
Accuracy of text we're talking about. That's a good edition. We're not talking about, but normally Darul Ta'sil is sufficient. But if you're looking for students, a lot of students will suffice a Bushra print. The Bushra print would normally have the Ahmed Ali Saharanpuri footnotes. They will add in some other footnotes, and there will be a lot of things going. So that's for students that are quite reader friendly. But in terms of accuracy of the text, normally Darul Ta'sil is your best bet. But now this Bayt Sunnah edition is out. It seems to be a very good job. I've not gone through it myself. Scholars have praised it. There have been some critics of it as well. That will wait, because what normally happens is you have to let a book go out there. Numerous scholars are going to view it, read it, or take sometimes some years, and then you have people giving feedback, and then eventually you come to some sort of scholarly consensus saying, this is a good edition, but, or this is the best edition we have, or these are some of the shortcomings, and that takes a while. Sometimes when students come and a book comes out and say, Ustad, what's the best edition? Is this a good edition? They don't understand what that requires. So a lot of the times people say it's a good edition. It's not them going through it. They've gone on Twitter, or they've gone on where Sheikh has said, this is a good edition. They're kind of parroting that. Otherwise, to actually know if something's a good edition takes a lot of time. Yeah. Especially if you're looking at big texts like, okay, the new edition of Fathul Bari's come out. How good is that? So you can only judge about what they're claiming, and then you have some scholars that have gone through parts of it, and the longer you take, the more of it has been studied, and the more of a accurate picture you can start to get of what is a good and a bad edition. So we're not looking at that right now. I'm just going to explain that point. Yeah. We're looking at this book, the Bayt al-Sunnah edition, and the Madkhal that they wrote. This is the introduction that they wrote, and as you can see, it's quite a hefty volume, right? And it's in terms of quality, it's up there with the best, right? In terms of quality of paper, you got your copy there right now as well, right? In terms of quality of paper, very nice. The reason I'm starting off with this is because it touches a lot of the same topics of recension as well. So in terms of contribution, so when you look at the Nuristani, the Madkhal, it's not going to have much in terms of new that we didn't know about regarding Bukhari or his Sahih. Yeah. You're going to have a lot of the set topics, etc., right?
Just information just made in a more repackaged.
Yeah. The Mufti Muntasir book, it provides a new insights, because I've not seen anyone that's done that before, which is looked at the other recensions and the conclusion, although is we will accept, it's not going to change any conclusion, because every scholar will say, yeah, we trust Farabri anyway, but he's gone through an angle that has not been done before. So there's a depth. That's the best way to frame it. Yeah, it's a depth to a conversation now that we didn't have before. So it adds that to it, even though it's not going to change our outlook in how we deal with Bukhari. But that objection now has another angle to respond to now, which is more like, you can demonstrate rather than based on authority. So in terms of contribution, this is a very, very good edition. All right, so you want to read a solid study regarding the recension of Bukhari, going into the biographies of those who transmitted it, a critical biography, right, using a range of sources. This is by far one of the best books I've seen, right? A very, very good, up-to-date work. And what he does is he goes through the various recensions of Sahih Bukhari, starting with the first tabaqah, so the Farabri's, the Hammashaki, the Nasafis, and so on and so forth. And then he goes through Farabri's recension, who the major imams are. Then he talks about transmissions from Bukhari, etc., that were falsely assumed to be a transmission of Sahih Bukhari, which were actually not. And then he also highlights other transmissions of Sahih Bukhari where he thinks it's possible that they transmitted Bukhari, and then we know the known transmitters of Bukhari. A lot of these people who are transmitters, they were not necessarily great scholars of their own, meaning famous scholars of their own right. Let me explain this phenomenon, inshallah, right? Quite quickly. Sometimes a great scholar, so if you have a sheikh who's amazing, great scholarship, what they require for their scholarship to be preserved is not necessarily a great charismatic student, because a great charismatic student is going to bring his own following. What a lot of these great mashayikh require are those khadims, those students that are going to dedicate themselves to the sheikh's work. Because if, for example, I have a sheikh and I'm on par with that sheikh, I'm going to be doing my own books. I'm not going to sacrifice my own scholarship to just preserve. Some people do that, right? So usually a lot of these transmitters are not necessarily, I'm not saying all the time, not necessarily going to be their big names. Because the big names are not only teaching. These are the scribes. These are the guys who are very meticulous in writing and doing all of that. So in that sense, so what they do is they kind of take out a lot of this information to squeeze it out, and we kind of provide a lot of good depth regarding these transmitters that you probably didn't know before. So it's a very detailed book in regarding that. You want to pause for Maghrib? So we pause for Maghrib, inshallah.
And we're back from Salat al-Maghrib, so we'll continue. We are on the Bayt al-Sunnah edition of Sahih al-Bukhari, and particularly the introduction that the editors wrote with regards to the book, and how they've detailed explanations of the recensions, those who actually transmitted the book from Imam Bukhari, i.e. the first level of the transmitters, then their students as well. And that job was done particularly very, very well. And from there, I will let you continue.
Yeah, so that's what we were kind of stopping. There's people like diagrams. You have diagrams in this as well as Mufti Muntasir uses this book as well for his work as well. Like he kind of engages with this book throughout his introductory work as well. So it's quite useful there. And as you can see, the Madkhal is called al-Madkhal al-Jami al-Musnad Sahih wa nuskhatil Yuniniya. As I mentioned, I've got an article online which kind of introduces a Yunini nuskha, what that basically means, which is in reference to a scholar who came in the 9th century or before, in the 8th century. I've got the details here anyways. I'll send the article, inshallah. And what he did was he, using the resource in front of him, made what is known as a critical edition. So the various recensions of Sahih at his time, he went through them and he kind of made this kind of super edition. He's used all the variants and it has a key, very much like a modern critical edition. So in this there's a variant here, in this nuskha is a variant, and basically makes this kind of immense copy. When Sahih Bukhari was initially published, outside of the Ahmadi Sahanpuri, the Indian print, every other Sahih Bukhari publication we have is working off the Yunini nuskha. So Yunini was working off the recensions that go back to Farabri. So his work has become the blueprint for all the current Sahih Bukhari, and the most famous one was the Sultaniya print. The Sultaniya print by Abdul Hamid II, under his patronage, that was published. And then from there, all of these various publications that come, they're trying to either use the Sultani edition or they're using some form of that to kind of reproduce that. So what this does is kind of it goes through what the Sultani edition is, some of the problems in it, and it goes right back to the Yunini nuskha. Like I said, we're not interested in how accurate they are, because that's a different study of how good the edition is of Sahih Bukhari that they've published. But it's a very useful introduction to the Yunini nuskha. The article I wrote was before this had come out. So there'll be much more information in here. And even in there, I give some references to others as well. So if you want to look what the Yunini nuskha is in more detail, I've written about that. And then you can actually look into here in far more detail regarding that.
Are there any particular standout points that they make in this introduction that you would find is like very key to the actual contribution they've made?
Well, in terms of, so the main thing I would say is, as before, is that the way that they have documented the transmission of Sahih Bukhari and the information they provided itself, because I've got notes here about recensions, but because we're trying to rush through them, I'm not going to normally do it the way you normally do it, because when you go through parts, it takes ages. So we have that 2.5 hour podcast, right? We're trying to cram it in a bit more, right? But there are parts, but just in general, just for the general reader. So if you're going to read this, the thing that really stands out is the way that they have mapped, and not just that, the way they have reconstructed the history of how the book was transmitted. And of course, like any of these type of works, there will be mistakes and errors and maybe things that we correct. And there are a couple of things that I've pointed out, which again are going to be quite niche topics to go and look into. But beyond that, it's a very, very useful book for those students who are looking to delve into that discussion. Like, it's quite a niche discussion, but it's a very important discussion. Why? Because if you want to engage with the Sahih Bukhari, one of the aspects of Sahih Bukhari is the variations that you have in some of the editions. So to kind of work out whether something is a mistake or it's a discredited variant or a valid variant or the correct variant, you need to have some knowledge of this, right, to some degree. So this is why when a person is going for something like a super commentary Sahih Bukhari, like Fathul Bari, if you're not trained or competent in various ulum that you require for Sahih Bukhari, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because in one time you're talking about lugha, then you've gone about the chapter heading of Bukhari, then some fiqh ikhtilaf, then there could be about the text of Bukhari itself, it could be about a narrator, right? And so there's a lot of discussions that are taking place, so it requires a lot. This is on one specific aspect of it. So it does have, of course, the natural, so what they've done at the end is to not miss out on like every other madkhal, like a biography of Imam Bukhari, they've just incorporated in here Ibn Hajar's biography of Imam Bukhari. So he said that upon وَمَعَهُ هِدَايَةُ السَّارِي لِسِيرَةِ الْبُخَارِ, and they've added that right at the end. And so then you've got this kind of, so I would say the first half of this work is a very, very good book for those students who are interested in looking at the intricacies and details. And if you want like a more of a summarized, briefer version, in English, Mufti Muntasir's book is very useful. So if most people, I think, just go with the English one. And if you have more time on your hands, then have a look at this book, inshallah. It's very useful.
That's, alhamdulillah, that's very good. Just bearing the time. Do we want to go look at the next?
Let's go for the next two.
Yeah.
Right. And then we'll take a few questions about it, inshallah, right? So the next work I'm looking at is called Madkhal ila Sahih Al-Bukhari by Sheikh Muhammad Ya'qubi.
Okay.
Right. This is what this was, because this is, again, is a publication of the whole Sahih Bukhari, and then an introduction was written. I read this book when it first came out. Now, it must be 3-4 years ago. I can't remember exactly. So I've got notes from when I read it from then. But I'm just going to give you guys just what this book's about, because it's a madkhal as well. Just like every madkhal, you're going to have life and times of Imam Bukhari. It's not going to really contribute much, whatever. But this edition, what they did was they reproduced the Sultaniya edition.
Okay.
So if I mentioned to you before, this is this kind of critiques on the Sultaniya edition as well. And there's like an update Unini Nuskha.
Yeah.
This is a reproduction of the Sultani edition with some minor corrections on some things that they thought, like typos and stuff, right? They corrected. What makes this stand out is, number one, he does discuss the topic of those who question. Like I said, most of the current madkhals, they do tackle this question of attribution because of this. Like I said, this nonsensical argument that goes around. They've tried to challenge that. So he does touch upon that and mentions the same point, like, regardless of the early Imams that were very much opposed to Imam Bukhari, no one challenges the attribution of the book to him. So even when Daraqutni is doing a critique on some of the hadith, or whether it meets a condition of, or whether Imam Bukhari should have included in his Sahih, or hadith doesn't include, it shouldn't be in there, he doesn't question the attribution of the book to Bukhari.
Yeah.
Right? So he mentions this, like, these arguments in there. It's very useful, talks about that. But what kind of stands out where this Madkhal does like an introduction, a contribution, is that it's probably the most detailed background to Sultaniya print. Okay. So again, it's quite a niche topic. So if you're interested in one of the the best until the recent editions of Sahih Bukhari, then this print this Madkhal does a very lengthy introduction into both. It talks about Unini, and then it talks about, because the Sultaniya print was based on Unini, talks about Sultaniya print in a lot of detail, the history behind it, how it's commissioned, gives a biography of Abdul Hamid Thani, and so on and so forth. So if you're interested in that, this is a very useful read for you, right? In terms of the standard, it also does a one section where he talks about because he's got, the Sheikh Muhammad Ya'qubi, he's come from a scholarly family, so they have this very, deep library. What do I mean by that is, like, yourself, myself, we didn't come from a scholarly family, so we don't have any libraries that are inherited. But if my great-grandfather was a scholar and grandfather was a scholar, then you kind of inherit these very old editions or manuscripts, etc. So he has, like, in his library from his father, grandfather, because they're all from a scholarly family. So he does talk about the various editions he has of Sahih Bukhari in his library. So that's very useful. Then he goes into Sultani edition. Again, it's quite niche, right? But if you're interested in that kind of background, it's very good. Beyond that, he doesn't do what the Sheikh Nuristani does. Okay. In terms of, like, the the divide up in talking about the various aspects of Bukhari, the mu'allaqat. He doesn't really go into that in some great detail or any contribution. But that's the main thing that this Madkhal contributes to. Okay. Yeah. Very brief, inshallah. Like I said, there's a lot to say, but we're going to keep it brief. And lastly, is this introduction of Sahih Bukhari, which is called Madkhal Ra'i' ila Sahih Al-Bukhari wa ma fi min asrar wa sana'i' by Dr Muhammad Akram Nadwi. Right, this is by Dr Akram Nadwi, published by Dar Ammar. This again came out a few years ago. I read this when I first bought it. So again, just a few points regarding this introduction. So some of the positives I'll say about the book, firstly, right, is that it touches upon Bukhari in a very broad way. So what you expect from a madkhal, all of those things are ticked. So meaning he talks about Bukhari, talks about the various aspects of Bukhari, his madhab and all those kind of discussions. Then he goes into the Jami as well, goes into a lot of detail, goes into some of the Rijal of Bukhari, the Thulathiyat of Bukhari, talks about his own Isnad of Bukhari where he studied it as well. So he mentions those information in there as well. And then he goes into a deep dive into Imam Bukhari's methodology. So, like, when he talks about Imam Bukhari talking about connected chain, he kind of demonstrates how Imam Bukhari operates in trying to demonstrate connected chains. And so these what he refers in the introduction as asrar, these kind of secrets of Bukhari that requires quite some depth. He kind of tries to unravel that. And then he has a section at the end where he even responds to doubts or objections against Sahih Bukhari. And that same point about the attribution is also discussed, where he says similar points like, you know, how the sun being out in daytime doesn't require proof, and that's analogous to trying to question Imam Bukhari's attribution. So he does it's quite large, right? We're talking about quite a hefty, it's over 500 pages, where he goes through a lot in this. So in that sense, it's a useful introduction. But that being said, there are a few things that I would, some I would say are a bit personal, like things but unnecessary. What kind of increases the size of the book unnecessarily is that there's large parts of books which are just copied and pasted from other works. And so it kind of increases the size, I think, unnecessarily, but this comes down to the reader, to be honest, right? So it's not one of those that discredits the book in any way. But what do I mean by this is he will talk about, let's say, the famous narrators that come in Bukhari a lot. So then if it's like maybe Qatada or Ikrimah, whoever he's got, right? Then he will do a biography of them, but that will be taken from either Tahdhib al-Kamal or Sir A'lam Nubala, one of these books, and it'll just be like 3-page copy and paste. Then 3-page copy and paste. So then I would say if you're a student and you don't want to go back to these books, okay, maybe it's useful. Personally, I think it just increases the size of the book unnecessarily because a lot of these stuff are accessible. Yeah. But I can imagine there must be students out there that think, I can't bother to go back. It's nice to have it in one place. Great. But he doesn't really add much to a lot of the bios. It's just kind of copied from different places, which is fine. It's not a problem, but it makes the book much more larger.
Does he do any analysis or any kind of critique, anything that he mentions?
So not on those parts. Not on those parts. I think the main thing that he kind of does in this book, but this is what makes so this is not a book which I would say a 4th or 5th year student will utilize, because when he goes into like the big bulk of the book about the manhaj of Imam Bukhari. This is me again reading from 2-3 years ago, the book, right? I went over it briefly again, but when I first read it properly, it was about 2-3 years ago. That he doesn't, so he's left it very complicated. What do I mean by that is he's not simplified it for us. Okay. So if you're not already informed in the field of ulum al-hadith, the words, the istilahat and the manhaj, it's not going to be broken down for you that easily. You need to know what's going on. So this is why I would say that a lot of the people that can kind of really understand some of the asrar that he's talking about will be students that actually study Bukhari already. So it's like, I know this already, I've heard these terms, but now I can kind of see this deep analysis from what's going on. So it's not the most reader-friendly in that sense, some of the discussions, because he kind of expects a lot from the expects a lot from the reader. So I would say that's something to kind of keep a lookout for. If you're looking as a 5th year, 6th year student, you want to buy this and you're trying to read through it, you're going to struggle unless you're already quite competent in the field of ulum al-hadith. And the last section I was mentioning to you before was that he kind of answers some objections to the Sahih Bukhari. So he talks about the hadith of age of Aisha radhiyallahu anha. Again, one of the things he kind of just responds, I think he quotes Sheikh Ahmed Shakir. So it's a lengthy quote, like what his response was, and he kind of mentions that in here. When he talks about like for example, you have in Sahih Bukhari, Imam Bukhari sometimes says, Haddathana Muhammad, that Muhammad told me, narrated to me. And many scholars like Al-Abadi, etc., have said that this is actually referring to Al-Zuhli. But Imam Bukhari does tadlis here in terms of he conceals his name, so people don't know because of his dispute with him. It's a very famous point. So he objects to this, saying that no, he doesn't do tadlis al-shuyukh. So he has a quite a lengthy quotation. Not quite. He kind of summarized the discussion of one of his sheikhs. Let's see if I can find it right now. If not, I'll put the references up, inshallah, after you can check it out after yourself, inshallah. But he kind of takes that to task. He doesn't accept that that Imam Bukhari is doing tadlis al-shuyukh. It's not really clear the position that he was taking, but some of the contemporary scholars have suggested that So one way is to say that Muhammad is not referring to Dhuhli at all.
Okay.
Right? He's talking about other ruwat. But then there seems to be good evidence to suggest that this is referring to that. So one way of reconciliation that some contemporary scholars I've seen do is that he was referring to Dhuhli, but he wasn't doing it out tadlis. It was as ikhtisar, as many people do, just say Muhammad, assuming that you know what I'm talking about.
Dhuhli is famous in his own right. So.
Yeah, so he didn't do it out tadlis, which is like to deceive, conceal his name for any of those reasons. And there's also reasons why he suggested that. For example, he goes that the Sahih would have been gathered before that happened anyway, so it wouldn't need to conceal. Although one can argue maybe later he amended it, who knows, right? So he kind of mentions those kind of insights. He also takes the position when it comes to the whole dispute of ana, the apparent ikhtilaf between Imam Muslim and Bukhari. He takes the same position as Sheikh Hatim and Sheikh Awama, which is that there is no ikhtilaf between Imam Muslim and Bukhari. There is no shart al-liqa for Imam Bukhari. That's not a condition. Those who know what I'm talking about. But the Bahith, you just know that Sheikh Akram Nadwi takes the position of Sheikh Hatim and Sheikh Awama. Right? You can check up, they've got books on these topics as well. You can see what they say. He more or less takes the same stance. And I'm sure from what I've read, it seems to be the same as that. Now, at the end, I was mentioning that he responds to some objections. Now, what I thought was important to mention here, because I'm sure some readers may also, or listeners, may point this out, that how is Shaykh Akram responding to objections against some of the hadith Sahih Bukhari, where he himself has denied the hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam being affected by magic, and that's in Sahih Bukhari. I read that article that he wrote, like a post that he wrote a while back, and there was refutations of it in Arabic. Again, I'll share the refutation in Arabic, but when I went back to look for it, I couldn't find it, like online anymore, and I couldn't find it on his Telegram channel. I also asked a friend, and he said he'll ask his student or something, so I'm still waiting. The reason why I'm saying that is because I'm not sure if he's retracted his stance. So I don't want to criticize something which is retracted from, but just to be clear, the hadith is in Bukhari, and the arguments that he had given to object to the hadith can be given to some of the responses that he's giving to the objections that are given to the hadith Sahih Bukhari, if that makes sense. So if he's retracted that stance, alhamdulillah. If he's not, then that's a problematic stance, and I think he doesn't discuss it here. Not that I can't remember seeing that discussed here, unless it's somewhere in the thick of the book I may have missed or something, right? But from the objections place, I have not seen him discuss that. So I make dua that he's done ruju from that stance, because it's a very silly stance to hold, I think anyway. And I think the evidence is quite clear of the hadith Bukhari in supporting that. What he does is he has one of these objections that he responds to, which is the hadith, which is hadith ightisal bani Israel urat, which I referred to before, which is the hadith in Sahih Bukhari where the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions that the Bani Israel, they would bathe nude, but in crowds, basically do like a collective baths, basically, right? And Musa alayhi salam, he would bathe by himself, so no one could see him. So they began to make spread rumors about something being physically defected of Musa alayhi salam. So here the response, most ulama in the past, their response was quite simple. They said this was either allowed, because the objection basically is that how could they be with no clothes and Musa is not object to them? Why would he allow that? So the two responses that you normally find in classical commentaries is that this was either done, it was allowed in their sharia, or these are fusaq. So it's either they were allowed in the sharia, or these are fusaq that were not following the rules of sharia, right? And they spread this rumor around, and so that's the response. And then there's the objection about how can Musa alayhi salam come out and be exposed like that. The responses were quite simple, that, well, why not? Because the Messenger of Allah mentions it. He knows best the maqam al-nubuwwah, the stages of nubuwwah, and he never saw anything problematic here because he didn't do it out of his own action. So what's the issue? Now, the angle that Dr. Akram takes is that no, the urat here, which is mean nude or naked, doesn't refer to with no garments. It means that you're wearing an izar, right? That you're wearing an izar, and what Musa alayhi salam, so they were still wearing clothes, but he wouldn't want to be in front of them, so because he was shy, so he would stay. So no one was doing haram, they were wearing clothes. So when he came, then the objection comes, well, then how did they see that he didn't have any defect? So then he kind of looks at ihtimal and say maybe you could see through it or something like that, right? The only issue I have is that I don't mind. They ask, like for example, Allama Kashmiri, he mentioned this could be in D during the years that they were roaming around. That could have been at that time that this could have happened, and maybe some commentators, I can't remember who said it, but if your garments are wet, that you can sometimes see through the garment. So that's what it was referring to. Allah knows best. But the only issue I have with this, the way he's kind of detailed it, was that he also kind of accepts the objection of the objectors.
Yeah.
So he's kind of accepted the premise and based upon that done the ta'wil.
Okay.
The only reason why I have an issue with that this time, just put this to a side for a second, right? Is that if, for example, I believe from my research, I don't, but let's say from my research, I believe that Aisha anha was 16 when she married the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there are arguments to suggest that age. I've written about this that I don't think there's any evidence for that. Right? I'm sorry, there's evidence, but I think the evidence is very weak. Right? It's quite clear she was young. But if I take that position of 16, okay, that's your tahqiq. People have historical analysis about what certain words mean all the time. But if I do it on the premise that it's unethical to suggest less, then you're making kind of like a damning statement against the zahir, or what is the clear meaning of the narration. Yeah. So if you mention as ihtimal, like I think maybe she was older because of X, Y, and Z reasons, okay, then we can be open to ihtimal. But when you kind of accept the premise, then in essence you're accepting that they're correct. Yeah. And so sometimes these premises need to be deconstructed to say, do they have, meaning, is it a problem that you're claiming, or is it a problem that you've created? Similar of sihr. Yeah. If the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Sahih Al Bukhari is telling us that he was affected by magic, and the Surah Falaq and Surah Nas were revealed in reaction to this, then if someone says, well, this goes against the maqam al-nubuwah, but my question would be that if you accept Sahih Bukhari Sahih, then surely that's the best place to tell us what the maqam al-nubuwah is. Yeah. Right? Who's at a better place to tell you what the stage of al-nubuwah is? The Hadith Sahih Bukhari from Messenger, which is Sahih, or me? So you say, well, let's go with what that is saying. If I think that there's something in the hadith that has some alternative ihtimal, then I can maybe it means this. And there are many shurrah, if you go for the commentary tradition, you find these kind of alternative explanations there. Waqila, it is said this, waqila, it is said that. But if you kind of accept the premise as being, that becomes a problem.
It becomes a thinly veiled attempt to explain away the issue.
I don't think it's necessary to do so.
As opposed to just giving you an alternative interpretation.
Yeah, it's a fine line. Hopefully you're making sense here, right? But it's a fine line. But beyond that, I think, so if you're looking at introductions, right, like I said, it's a bit wordy, it's a bit difficult, I think, for students to kind of go through it. Some of the issues I mentioned of like lengthy quotations, but he does give insights, right, to the Shuruh al-Bukhari, because Shaykh Akram is someone who's engaged with the book for a number of years. So I would say, if you're asking now, or you haven't asked, but I'm just going to say anyway, that as a student, what would be the tips? You can give your take as well, because you've done Dawrah as well. I would say that if you're a student that's starting up, then the Madkhal that you've done, or any other Madkhal that's out there, which is like a simple introduction, whether it's in English, whatever, you just start off with that. So that kind of preps you for your study of it. Even if you're not doing Dawrah, but you're looking to look into Sahih Bukhari. Or
you're just engaging with hadith texts because you're in Mishkat and you're coming across narrations from Bukhari.
Even if you're not a student, I'm saying, right? If you know Arabic, you're studying, and you want to know about Bukhari, right? Then those are the books you want to check out. I think if you're going to buy these books that I've been reviewing, you're going to struggle a bit. So I've just kind of highlighted what these things touch upon. So even though the most comprehensive is Shaykh Akram's, these other books may not be doing it for you. If what you're looking for, those will kind of help you out much more to navigate through the books, more clearly written than some of these which are more wordy or a bit more difficult to navigate through or more complicated. That's point number one. So you start off like that. Then when you start off your study of the books like Sahih Bukhari, which, as I mentioned, is an immense task. What I would normally say to students, similar if you remember what we said about Mishkat, is that you should not overwhelm yourself with large commentaries. What you want to do is that you want to choose, and there's no need to debate, you get something like Fathul Bari, or you can get Umdatul Qari, one of these large commentaries. Fathul Bari is the most famous. Umdatul Qari has a lot of the same content overlap. It does a few other things as well. But you can have these two or one of these.
Whether that's plagiarized is a different story.
That's irrelevant right now, right? But it's good because you can overlap information. So because Al-Aini engages with the text critically, right? So anyway, so you can get those two texts, right, with you. So that means either you have a soft copy on you have a laptop, or you have it with you somewhere, right, the volume that you're going through in class. But that's not the text you're going to look through every day, because if you're going to read through that every day, you're not going to get through much because of the amount of content in that. Also, you're going to struggle because, as I mentioned, some of the discussions and they have a prerequisite of them require competence in other ulum. So you're not going to necessarily get it completely. What you want to do is you want to get like a hashia, right? Something that talks with the gharib al-fadh, the wording of the Sahih. So something like Ahmed Saharanpuri's, which is on the Bushra print anyway. So you want to make a job of trying to go through those. You get your sheikhs who has given you dars as well. You want to kind of navigate through that. What I would say is, alongside your Sahih Bukhari, so now you've got these two commentaries or one commentary, you get Ibn Hajar's Taqrib al-Tahdhib, right? Ibn Hajar's Taqrib al-Tahdhib should be there throughout your study of Dawrah. So anytime a narrator comes up, you can just go locate them and see when they came, whatever, right? And then you can if a name is coming up constantly. So there's two ways. So one is like books like this which tell you the names that come constantly, but that's not going to stay in your mind for too long. The names that you notice that come up constantly, and then you go out your way to find them. So you can go up to Tahdhib al-Kamal or Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, or you can go into Sir Alam al-Nubala, these books, whatever you want to go through, and find the entries. A lot of these narrators in Bukhari are famous narrators, and especially the ones that commonly they're going to be famous. So a simple Google search as well to find them in Arabic will be quite useful. So you have those, so you kind of familiarizing yourself with the isnad. Now, I wouldn't say a super focus on isnad, because a lot of the students that are going to Dawrah don't have the prerequisites to understand a lot of what happens in Bukhari unless the teacher guides them through that. So that's on the key teacher. The teacher goes through the isnad and explains it, great. If he doesn't, you might struggle a bit. So that's why it's good for some of these books that come later or post-graduation to kind of see that if a teacher's not helping you out with that. So you have your hashia, you have the commentaries, right? Those commentaries are there because anytime you get stuck or something you want to look into more, you can then refer back to the larger commentary. You have your Umdatul Qari. If you're Hanafi, you want to know the Hanafi evidences, then you can go refer back to Al-Aini and see what is there a Hanafi take, or how do they interpret this hadith, or how do they engage with them. There are other commentaries, of course. Qastalani is there, Faydul Bari, Ulama Kashmiri, but Faydul Bari, Ulama Kashmiri is his transcribed lectures. So it's not going to be consistent.
It's not going to be like a book.
It's not consistent commentary, right? It's going to have like comments and sometimes no comments and comments, and he'll go into something that he wants to go into, and he kind of engages with. Similarly with the recently published, still being published, Nibras al-Sari of Sheikh Yunus rahimahullah, is that he's a lot of times engaging with Ibn Hajar. So reading a standalone can sometimes be difficult. So like a hashia, which is written just to explain the text to you, is much more easy for a student. And then those books are there to kind of, okay, I read Ibn Hajar made this point. Let me see Fayd. You go to Faydul Bari. Let me see what Sheikh Yunus says, and maybe we can engage with it. But that's going to be for like specific topics because you don't have that much time because you have so much to cover. So if you have these kind of books around you, I think that's a reasonable, practical way. It's not overburdened. So you've got your little madkhals and stuff. Now these books that I mentioned, these are more niche topics then. That you want to go into something more detailed, something more complicated. Then you can kind of enhance your mutala'ah, your reading wider, and it gives you much more well-rounded. But that can come after. If you have time during, then great. But after, that can come and that can really, supplement your reading, inshallah. That would be my advice anyway.
That's actually very helpful. I think a lot of students go into Bukhari being overwhelmed by the sheer amount they have to cover and not realizing these, or not fully comprehending the amazing work of Imam Bukhari in his Sahih, because of the fact that they focus on the riwayah, and then the self-reading that they do is next to none because they don't really know where to start, and they always hear the famous names Fathul Bari and all this, so they try and access Fathul Bari, then they realize Fathul Bari is like 26 volumes and finding the narration they need to find takes long for them, and then on top of that, reading the 20 pages of discussion that he's put in there for that one hadith or two hadith is even longer. It just becomes tiresome.
That's why even some, I don't want to just make it restricted to just Dawrah hadith students, because one advice that Sheikh Hatim was giving was that there should be an attempt, some years back he said this, that to do like a khatam of Bukhari yearly or every few years, because that kind of has you the foundation about Islam, the authentic narrations. So you want as a student engage with it. So even once you've studied, you've done Dawrah, some students ask me like, I want to go through Bukhari again. Practical advice to get people together be easier, but if you want to go through it yourself, again, the books like Fathul Bari, what you want to do, as I mentioned, is that if you kind of, whatever bab you're doing, you're of Bukhari, and you have that bab saved, it's on your phone and stuff, you have whatever it is, right, it's saved, it just makes that process easier to kind of go through, because if you're just doing random places and then you want to find it, it's a long process.
Yeah.
If you're not doing shamil and stuff, but even then, to be honest, it can be complicated, it can take time.
Yeah.
So the fath is there, is very important, but the more you know, the more you benefit from these commentaries.
Yeah, exactly.
The less you know, you're not going to benefit much.
Yeah.
And so it's just going to be an abstract book in the distance. So how do you make that familiar to yourself? It takes steps to get to a stage where you can just start opening up Fath and open up Umda and say, oh, I get this. Oh, I get what's happening here. Right? When you open up like a Madkhal like this, oh, I'm already aware, because a lot of these books, which you call Madkhal, they're more dirasas, they're more studies rather than the sense of an introduction. Right? They're just more as, this is my study of certain sections. The way you're going to be able to engage with those books, because a lot of students get disheartened because you open up a book and say, I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah.
Right? I've opened this up and it's saying all these words, I don't know what's going on. And it can be quite disheartening, but it has to be a long-term process where you look at a point, something comes up, and then you say, look, I'm going to look that point up. Then you go open up the first commentary, you try to find it. Now, if you don't find it, it's not a fail. Why? Because you'll find 3-4 other points. And that's how you find information.
Yeah.
A lot of the times when, I'm looking for one thing, like there's examples of, I've looked into a, like it's randomly the other day, right? I was looking into a mas'ala about, I forgot the topic was. And it was basically Ibn Ujaym had these Q&As, like a miscellaneous Q&A. So I was looking for it and I just came across it randomly. And in it, he was asked a question about killing a cat. And he goes, oh, if it causes harm, you can kill cats. And so it happened to coincide with someone asking me this. Now, the reference was so obscure. Meaning it's not a book that you normally go to. But I had that fresh in my mind. But the reason I had it fresh in my mind, I would never have found that. Right? But that came up because I was looking for something else.
Yeah.
So there's never a fail in this. So if you're going through any of these books and you say, oh, I just can't find the answer, that's a fail of an hour or two. It's not. If you're actually reading it, you will find so much other things going on. This is why it's why it's very important that you kind of steady yourself into these books. And then over time, you start with 10, 15%, you understand, 20, 30, 40, and then you get to a stage where 80, 90%. Once you're at that stage, now you're comfortable in engaging with these books.
Yeah.
But you're trying to work towards it. Anytime you stop, and the longer you stop for, the percent goes less. Because when you come back to it again, if you're at 20%, you come back to 10% again. So you have to maintain it. But it's very disheartening.
I think from when we were in class, I think one point that really helped was because we didn't have a lot of time and we had to really focus on a few things if we were to benefit from the book. So one thing that we did when we were studying a certain section of Bukhari is that we focused more on the chapter titles, because there's a whole discussion about what does Imam Bukhari mean by his chapter titles and what does it tell us about Imam Bukhari's opinions about certain things. So focusing on those chapter titles and then focusing on what's Imam Bukhari trying to tell us with his chapter title. Then each hadith he brings in that same chapter, what's he trying to prove in relation to his chapter title. And that really helped because it helps understand the coherence of the book as opposed to just a thing.
Yeah.
And that was really good as like a base.
The only thing I would say is that comes down to how your teacher wants to teach you.
Yeah.
So you don't have control over that.
Yeah.
So some teachers teach you this way, some teachers make it into a fiqh lesson, some rarely, but some make it into an isnad lesson, whatever it is. The question is, how can you go into class prepped? Because that's from the teacher, right? He makes that connection and stuff. That's fine. How can you go into class prepped? So there has to be like you add another topic in there, right? So you say abwab chapter headings. Well, then you should then be aware of the books regarding that.
Yeah.
So there's Abwab al-Tarajim of Sheikh Zakaria.
Yeah.
Ibn Munayyar's got a book on this, and Ibn Hajar, and also Al-Aini, also the comprehensive books, they also discuss this as well as other works. So then you may, if that intrigues you, the reason why I don't mention it because what happens is that book collection you have gets larger and larger.
Yeah.
And then you eventually not using any of them.
Yeah.
So you want to keep it restricted, right? And you want to keep it restricted, you're using them, you're benefiting. I'll give you an example, right? Some years ago, one of the, he was a teacher now, but he was a couple of years below me in madrasa. When he was doing Tarjamat al-Quran, he was asking which tafsir to go through. Now, myself, I had more time in the day, so I was using a few tafsirs. So he goes, I can't remember how the conversation, but he goes, I tried Ibn Kathir or something like that, but it's too long because I've got work. So then I said, why don't you try the Mukhtasar Tafsir Ibn Kathir of As-Sabuni? So he got it and he dedicated himself just to that. And so he actually went through, I don't know if he went to the whole thing, but most of it he went through. And now every time he talks and I see the students he teaches, all of them have the Mukhtasar Tafsir Ibn Kathir of As-Sabuni. And if you sometimes limit yourself to something smaller and you do it the whole thing, it has a far more long-term benefit. And then what you do is you expand your reading. Because you say, okay, I've done this now. Now I want to check, what does Qurtubi got to say? What does the full Ibn Kathir got to say? What does this got to say? And then you expand it. But what sometimes happens when you come into your study reading of having so much knowledge of books, and that's when Madkhals can sometimes be overwhelming. You say, there's 10 commentaries. And some of these works, like I think it was Shaykh Akram as well, where he talks about mustakhrajat, they don't make a distinction between what is published and not published. So you have these large lists, and he's not telling us if it's published or not. So you're like, well, which one do I go through? And that can be overwhelming. So you come with knowledge of so much books, but at the end of it, you're not doing anything because you don't know where to go. So it's always good to start off with something and say, look, I'm going to go through the whole thing here, and then I'll expand that rather than the opposite, where you come to the end where you barely do anything. And that's more of a common trait that I've seen in students rather than the other way around.
And I think Nuristani, he actually goes through the commentaries of Bukhari, mentions which ones are published. And I think he also gives a brief understanding of what that sharh gives the student. So it's good to actually access. As some of the madkhals I should have mentioned as well, one thing he didn't do, Shaykh Akram, was that he didn't allude to other things that were published, dirasas, and also the commentaries and stuff. He didn't tell us which ones were published or which editions and stuff. That was rarely mentioned. So that can sometimes, because some authors, what they would do is they will get like a fihrist where they mention list of commentaries, and they'll kind of copy and paste that here, and some of those books may be lost. Right, they're completely not known where they are, and so students kind of rummaging through looking for it, and they can't find it. So I think it's important that a distinction is made between what is published or help the student. Remember, the Madkhal is meant to be a guide. That's the idea. It's meant to be a guide. And now that we have more access to information in terms of we know what's published, what isn't, because in the past you're writing something, you say, I'm going to put the content here. If you find it, then great. Now, most of the times you can know what's published. Right? If you're in the know, it shouldn't take too long to know if a book has been published or not. So adding that in, I think, is very useful. Of course.
Definitely. So the absence of that does kind of be a shortcoming.
And I think just to sum it up as well, the importance of reading an introduction for a book is like Sahih Bukhari, and this is something that you can actually come in on as well. That just don't be fooled by the by Imam Bukhari's kind of style in his Sahih, and don't be fooled by the fact that he's just presented a hadith. And there's so many things going on in his book. It makes it such an advanced work. It makes it for the scholar to read. So going into that book, unassumingly thinking that it's easy to access and you're getting what you need from it, or you're understanding everything about it, is foolish, to say the least. Right? There's so much stuff going on inside the book, and then there's so many things you need to know, or there's things that you need to know before you even access that book. That if you don't have that information, when you actually open the book and then you hear objections about the book, you will think, hang on a minute, is this really Sahih? And I'll give an example, the whole concept of mu'allaqat, right? These narrations that are present in the Sahih Al Bukhari. Imam Bukhari mentions them, and he mentions a narration, but he doesn't do isnad of it, or he mentions it in a without sighatul jazm, and these kind of terms that are mentioned, right? If a person doesn't know about mu'allaqat and how Imam Bukhari is using them and what he's using them for, when someone comes to him and says, but this narration is not authentic and it's in Bukhari, how can you say Bukhari is authentic? He'll be stumped because he doesn't know what that is in the book. And that's what is kind of discussed in introductions that will help a person really come equipped when he reads these kind of books. Because at the end of the day, these are meant for scholars. They're not meant for the laity.
Most definitely. These are not... this is why you have related compilations to make it easier. So like Riyadh al-Salihin, these books are made for a bit more wider audience because they just take out the ahkam and they make it relevant to us. But these books are, in essence, a bab, a chapter heading is a sharh, is a commentary. So in essence, these are commentaries of hadith. So the Sahih Bukhari, you can technically say, is a commentary of hadith because he's telling you something from the hadith. It's not just this is everything I have. these are all Muslim hadith collections, take them. It's not. You're trying to present a certain meaning. So Imam Bukhari alludes to those meanings in his chapter headings or in the mu'allaqat, where he's trying to suggest certain opinions. And then, like we said, even that is a dedicated science. The Taghliq wa Ta'liq of Ibn Hajar, which is trying to look at the mu'allaqat narrations, or what's the rules of how to negate and relate with the mu'allaqat. If you have a prophetic mu'allaq hadith, is that different to a sahabi or tabi'i report? Can we find chains for all of them? Right? If you can find chains, does it mean there must be some illah, some defect in it? There's a lot. And you can do case studies, which can take an age. Right? Like, just to show you that why I'm trying to abstain from discussions, like one of the hadith in Sahih Bukhari, where you have the hadith of ma'azif, which is the musical instruments, that Imam Bukhari mentions, which is mu'allaq or not. It's from his Sheikh, or with the saying of qala. And so saying, haddathani, you know, to me, said qala, and then my Sheikh, I forget his name right now, he said. So now the question is that mu'allaq or not? If you say it's mu'allaq, then why is he doing that for? Is there an issue? Right? So many of the scholars have said, no, like this is complete muttasil, is Sahih. Right? And you have Ibn Hazm famously, and then a few contemporary scholars try to object and say, no, there's actually some sort of problem here. That's why he does it. And that one case study we do in one of our lessons here, and it's an hour and a half lesson, right? Just to explain the whole, and then to understand that, for example, the debate, you come, let's say, and say, I want to understand this debate. I say, okay, fine. Is qala, is that a sigha of ittisal or ta'liq, when if I say qala fulan so-and-so said, do we understand to be muttasil or not? So do you have that discussion happens in the book of Ulum al-Hadith. So you need to be aware of that discussion. And now we can then say, right, the discussion is there, does it apply here? So what you do now is you say, okay, let me look at how Imam Bukhari talks about it from his shuyukh. How does he narrate hadith from them? So then that will be a separate study. So before we can even start that discussion of sihha or da'af, you have to have two previous discussions before we can entertain this larger discussion.
Let alone the discussion on the matan itself.
Before we get into that, So this is why I'm saying it's not and I'm trying to demonstrate. I'm not trying to just say, because sometimes a lot of times scholars would say things are difficult, but a layperson or someone thinks, they're just saying that it can't be that difficult.
Exactly.
But when you kind of expose the discussion, that kind of humbles a bit. Like we did Engineering Mirza last episode, whenever it was, right? That when the discussions opened up, you go look at the comments or people looking at feedback, no one could actually challenge the content of it, because now we said, you want to have a discussion about the books? Okay, let's open up the books and see what it says. Because now it's not easy anymore. How do you explain that sanad? How do you explain this hadith? How do you explain that matan, this Arabic text? And then a person gets overwhelmed with information. Whereas if I can just give you a hadith and say, well, use this on someone, it's much more easier. So the idea is to kind of explain the complexity here. But anyway, we move on. Our topic now. We'll pause here. There's a lot more to say, but I wanted to keep this very brief. And also one of the reasons is because the books I read were quite a while back. So some of the information is still not as fresh in my mind. But hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of an overview of some of these books to check out, inshallah. We'll put up the links to either buy or soft copies on the channel. If anyone's got questions about these, we can take them, inshallah. If there's anything in the book that you found was objectionable, any of these books that you think I should have mentioned, just let me know. Maybe I missed it, or maybe I didn't think it was objectionable, whatever, right? Then I'll engage with you guys, inshallah.
Inshallah. And there we have it. That's our episode for today on the Sahih of Imam Bukhari. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.